For today's video, we return to Leyte Gulf, and to Japanese shipwrecks for that matter. In this case, the heavy cruiser Chokai. This is one of the more interesting shipwrecks out there because it tells us about her ultimate fate. Chokai went down with no survivors. Everything we know about the sinking came from other sources, which allowed for certain myths to propagate for decades after the ship sank. The most notable, of course, being the hit from USS White Plains. As the story goes, White Plains managed to set off Chokai's torpedoes with her 5-inch gun. This caused a massive explosion, which disabled the cruiser and forced her out of formation. For decades, it was assumed that White Plains did this. However, even at the time, there were reports indicating the damage had come from air attack. And when the wreck was located, well, there was no sign of a massive torpedo explosion. Or rather, no sign of the ship's own torpedoes going off. If you're interested in more detail on the sinking, I have a video on Chokai. I'll link that in the description. Because, frankly speaking, this is going to be a long enough video just looking at the wreck. It's arguably the best cover to Petrel's discoveries, rivaled only by the fleet carriers. As for the wreck, it was located on May 5th, 2019, and surveyed on May 30th. Petrel found the cruiser at a depth of 5,173 meters, or 16,972 feet, making her one of the deeper wrecks yet discovered. That depth has likely contributed to the preservation of the cruiser. Obvious battle damage aside, Chokai is pretty well preserved, especially by Japanese shipwreck standards. Let's look at the wreck now, starting with the sonar. This gives a good overview of the wreck site, though it doesn't show much detail on the hull itself. You can see an aircraft catapult to the top, which fell off during the sinking, which you can see on the bottom here. Beyond that, there's just a note about the bow section, which broke off during the sinking. So with that in mind, time for the wreck itself. Now, normally on one of these videos, I would go hull, weaponry, debris field, or some combination thereof. I'll still do that here, starting with the weaponry and then the hull, with the exception of the torpedo tubes, which will be saved for last, since those are the big thing with Chokai's story. In any case, we'll start here with the foremost turret. This has the barrels pointing almost straight up, which is an interesting look at the elevation given to those mounts, to make them ostensibly dual-purpose weapons, although their effectiveness in that role was questionable. I'll return to that in a second. First, we have the deck, which is completely covered in silt and debris, almost to the point of burying the barbette. It also looks like it falls away here. This might be the area where the bow broke, although I can't say for sure. For now, back to the turret. Here we have a look from closer in. This shows the barrels at their maximum elevation. It's a pretty common thing on Japanese cruiser wrecks. One of the complaints about these mounts was a fragile elevation gear, so it is entirely possible that failed during the sinking. It's also possible they were forced up by water pressure or by the force of the bow breaking away. Regardless, they're still angled straight up, as of when Petrel surveyed the wreck. The turret itself also shows clear signs of damage. Much of the metal has fallen or rusted away, exposing the framework, although it looks like you can see detached plates here. You can also barely make out the rangefinder beneath the barrels of turret 2, which, for their part, are flat and level, making it less likely turret 1 has the barrels in position to engage aircraft. As for turret 2 itself, that's mostly intact. There's some visible damage to the roof, and the ladder on the side is bowed out. There might also be some missing side plate here. Turret 3, for its part, is much the same. The overall condition matches up with turret 2, resting on the side, a bit of damage to the top, and the barrels laying flat. The major difference here is simply the barrels pointing to the stern instead of the bow. Those barrels are on the center line, pointing directly at the bridge tower, which, while we're looking at it, is pretty intact here. There's more rusting, including a badly covered ladder, but no major battle damage from this angle. As for turret 3, the top is in decently good shape, especially compared to the other turrets we'll be seeing later. Arguably more interesting in this picture is the look at the back of turret 2. You can barely make out an open door, or alternatively, a missing door. This is an opening into the back of the turret, along with 2 broken ladders, one still barely attached, and the other fallen onto turret 3. Those issues aside, the overall condition isn't terrible, until you move further up and see the condition of the rangefinder. That has largely rusted away, although I don't think this is fire or battle damage. It seems to just be thin metal slowly falling apart. As for the front of the turret, it's in better shape. There's less rusting, and the barrels seem to be perfectly fine. There is a bit of metal falling away towards the bottom, but that's about it. There is also one final look at turret 1, showing the barrels pointing just about vertically, like the other pictures, but from the rear this time. And with that rounding things off here, we can move on to the other weaponry. First, what remains of a triple 25mm mount. The mount itself is actually in pretty good shape. Even the seat is still there, which you don't normally see. The barrels, however, broke off near the breech. Even on the other IJN shipwrecks we've looked at, that generally doesn't happen. You'll see barrels completely covered in coral, but not broken off like this. I'm admittedly unsure if that's battle damage or from the sinking. Regardless, it's an interesting image. As is, for that matter, the hose behind it. We'll be seeing those here and there as evidence of attempts to fight the fire. This particular one is in good shape and also extending up the side of the superstructure, which goes to show how high those fires had spread. Moving on, though, the next weapon we have is one of the secondary guns. Chokai kept her 12cm guns. The sister ships, meanwhile, received newer 12.7cm weapons. This particular mount is pointing down and in pretty terrible shape. The barrel itself is fine, but much of the mount is wrecked, and the gun shield around it is also angled outwards. This one is on the starboard side, right next to the forward funnel, which is, presumably, the structure in the background. The other starboard gun is in about the same shape, really. The gun shield is rusted out more, but otherwise not much difference. Angled down with an intact barrel and wrecked mounting. This one is by the aft funnel, though it's too dark to make out much of that. Interestingly, though, the port side weapons are the opposite of the starboard ones. Not in terms of condition, which is more or less the same. The difference here is that the barrels are pointing up, and to the stern. This heavily implies they were engaging the air attacks right to the very end. Those attacks are noted as coming from the stern, so that would make sense. On this mount, the one to the stern, you can also see some damage to the deck, as well as some superstructure behind it with a blurry 25mm gun. The next picture is a better look at that particular mounting. In contrast to the one we looked at earlier, this is a dual mount and almost a complete reversal. The mount is rougher, including a piece fallen off here, but the barrels are mostly intact and in place. The same can't be said for the superstructure behind it, which is a mess of twisted metal and debris. That's probably what's left of the aft funnel, judging from the position of the 12cm gun next to it. Moving on, we have a single 25mm gun nearby. This is placed where a boat would have been carried, implying Chokai landed some of her boats. There's also a collapsed stairway in the background leading to the seaplane hangar. There's also another 25mm gun close by, another single in this case, and a mount that is lucky to still be attached, looking at the rusting next to it. Looking at the pattern, I believe that is from fire damage. That would have weakened the metal, if not burnt it out entirely, leading to this spotted rusting pattern. Eagle-eyed viewers might also make out the shape of the torpedo tubes in the holes. We'll come back to that later. First, the last 12cm gun. This one also includes a look at a torpedo loading crane here, as well as a porthole next to rusted out metal. And near the top of this image, a boat davit fallen into the mount. Looking at it from higher up, you can see why. The deck has another hole, and the davit has fallen over into it. There's another hole here, next to rusted out superstructure. However, it is still too dark to make out much more than that. As for the mount, like I said, pretty much like the others. And the gun is, like the other port side one, pointing up and to the stern. With that, we've rounded off the secondary battery. Before we move to the stern turrets, there are two more 25mm guns, a pair of single mounts next to the bridge. These are both almost perfectly intact, with some debris to the side. More interestingly, their position is indicative of Japanese strategy. The often memed on stick 25mm guns on every flat surface. These two exemplify that perfectly. That said, other than an open doorway into the bridge here and intact decking, there's not much else to say. So, time for the stern turrets. I saved these because they're interesting. First, we have the aftmost turret, number 5. This one has the barrels elevated, albeit at different angles. One is higher than the other. Considering the positioning of the port side 12cm guns, this might have been to engage aircraft. I can't say for sure with the lack of survivor reports. You can also see, although it's blurry here, the caved-in aft deck. We'll look at that in more detail later, but you can also see this on Maya. Might be a quirk of these ships, although Attigo hasn't been located yet to confirm that. Regardless, let's look at the turret for now. I wasn't joking about these being interesting, because on both, the turret roof is dished in. Combined Fleet, which I'll link in the description, notes this as likely bomb damage. I'm generally inclined to agree, but it's hard to say for sure. As for the rest of Turret 5, it's pretty similar to the bow turret. Rusticles and spots of rusted out metal, like here. Above it, Turret 4 is more or less the same. The turret face and sides are in roughly the same shape from this angle. Unfortunately, however, we don't get a good look at the turret roof. The next picture, and the last focus on the main battery, only shows part of it. It looks to be worse than Turret 5, but it's hard to make out more than that. Although we do get a nice look at the rangefinder, including a bit of the interior. However, that does finish the weaponry, aside from the torpedoes. So we'll take a quick look at the hull, and then wrap things up with the torpedo tubes. Since we're already on the stern, I'll move forward from here, starting with the extreme stern, which is completely caved in. You can see the sides of the hull, and then the deck just falling away. The round thing, for its part, is apparently a smoke generator. Either way, this looks bad enough from here. It looks worse when you move forward. The deck is completely caved in, to the point that the side of the hull is curved in like a peeled can. Very visible here with a ladder and some portholes. You can see the angle they're resting at. And this capstan here serves as a nice demonstration of how low the deck is, most likely from implosion damage. Unfortunately, that's about it here. Petrol didn't show more of the deck. We do have another shot of the stern at the waterline, however, where one of the props is completely buried in mud, and the rudder isn't much better. It does serve to confirm the rudder is on the center line, at least. Moving forward from here, we have the base for one of the catapults, probably the one that fell away. This is pretty rusty, but for the most part in one piece. The same goes for the deck around it, better seen here, along with another entrance into the ship in the background, and a hose left on the deck where the crew presumably dropped it. From here, we jump to the bow. Well, the bow part of the main wreck. The side of the hull here shows more rusting, along with another davit and some intact portholes. There also seems to be some damage, barely visible at the bottom. There's much more visible damage nearby. This is likely from an American torpedo and shows the belt armor here, as well as a buckling above it. This is in the general area of the forward magazines, so Chokai is very lucky she didn't blow up. Before I move on to the bridge structure, we have a brief look at the detached bow. This ended up inverted, as evidenced by the anchor here, which is still in place on a surprisingly rust-free hull, along with what might be the break beneath the text. The next picture shows the break, which is about as bad as you'd expect. This is rough, and yet there's an intact ladder here. I think that's more impressive than most things I've seen on shipwrecks, considering all the damage around it, likely broken off by damage from Fujinami scuttling the cruiser. Regardless, that wraps this up, so now the superstructure. Here we have the starboard side with another pair of 25mm gun mounts, and another open doorway with a rusted out ladder next to it, the same ladder we saw earlier with turret 3. Further up, we come to the bridge itself, which shows definite signs of fire damage, like the similar damage on Wasp, as well as a hose barely visible here, which confirms the fires reached all the way to the bridge. We also have a nice look into the bridge. Much of the equipment is gone, aside from the mountings, but this remains a fairly rare look. Petrol covered the bridges where they could, but you still don't see this much detail very often. You can even see it from the front as well, although there's not much more detail here, other than the pattern of rusting and rusticles. When we move further up, you can see the fire control level towards the top of the bridge tower. Here we have another hose to the side, along with a deep pile of silt towards the front, reaching almost to the windows. The more interesting bit, though, is probably the intact pair of binoculars here. Petrol gave us a nice zoomed-in look on those. The mount is in pristine shape, all things being equal, and the binoculars are pretty good as well, other than the rusting covering them. Moving even further up to the top of the bridge, we have the main gun command platform, which is pretty bad. The roof is gone, and the interior is a mess. This might be battle damage from the sheer devastation. This closer-in look just shows that even better. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if this was a direct bomb hit. Everything is a ruin, and the roof only has fragments left. The equipment on top of it is little better. Most of the face is gone, and the interior shows visible damage, which is still better than the rangefinder here, which has completely lost its protective covering, leaving a rusted-out mess behind. While we get a good close-in shot here, we don't have the visible writing like on Maya's wreck. The next few pictures, meanwhile, are a long look down the starboard side of the bridge. First, of the platform with the rangefinder, featuring another entrance into the ship here with more intact portholes. Further down, we see that entrance better, along with another base for more binoculars, and other open entrances into the ship even further down, which we can see better here. Next, we have the compass platform, where more hoses are visible. Actually, quite a lot of them, from the one we saw earlier here to a tangle of them here. The Japanese were clearly trying their best to fight the fire. You can see another hose here roping into the compass platform, along with more binocular bases and a compass itself here. This area is rough, but at the same time, pretty well preserved when you consider the situation. And with that, we've rounded off the bridge. Now for the torpedoes. First, we have the forward starboard mount. All four of them are like this one, trained into standby position with no torpedoes in sight. Those were launched at some point, either at the American ships or to jettison them. What's important here is that the tubes are trained in and completely intact. There's no sign of an explosion here. The same goes for the torpedo loading area for its part. There's no visible damage at all, or any torpedoes for that matter. As for the aft tubes on the starboard side, they're in the exact same position and condition as the bow set. No damage on the center line, and generally not blown up. You're probably beginning to see why Petrol confirmed that White Plains did not, in fact, blow up any torpedoes. The carrier most likely did hit Chokai, just not the torpedoes. Now when we move to port, we return to that burnt out area from earlier. You can see the deck damage towards the top, but you can also see the tubes in again the exact same position. While it does seem like something burnt here, there's still no sign of an explosion, or the torpedoes, so those were probably launched over here as well. There might have been an oxygen fire, but no explosion. There's more visible damage around the portside torpedo loading area. But even accounting for the darkness obscuring things, it still doesn't look like a torpedo explosion. And as you can see here, there's still no sign of any torpedoes. Which brings us to the final set of tubes. There's a decent hole that we saw earlier with the boat davit. However, there's still no sign of a massive torpedo explosion. Everything is pretty much the same. It's because of these pictures that we can pretty safely rule out Chokai being crippled by her own torpedoes. It's also a good point to end this video. Chokai's wreck is certainly an interesting one, if nothing else because the lack of survivors means this is the only way we can confirm what happened to the ship. Pretty much like HMAS Sydney in that respect. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.